The Oracle Network.
Hey, Rainbow Warriors. This is my disclaimer. Beyond the Rainbow is a true crime podcast. It's not suitable for young children, and maybe not even for some adults. I tend to swear like a sailor, and I'm kind of proud of that. Listener discretion is advised. Hey there, Rainbow Warriors. Welcome to the second part of the Colonial Parkway Murders. I'm your host, CJ. If you haven't heard part 1 yet, what are you doing? Don't be a cheater. Go back and listen to part 1 so this part will make sense. For those of you that did listen to part 1, let's jump right in where we left off. I told you about the murders of Cathy Thomas and her girlfriend Becky Dowski, and then the murders of David Knobling and Robin Edwards. A little over half a year after David and Robin's murder on April 10, 1988, the car belonging to 20-year-old Keith Call was found by a park ranger. The car had been abandoned at the York River Outlook on the Colonial Parkway. Keith had left a party with an 18-year-old girl named Cassandra Haley. The young couple was never seen again. Almost all of Keith's clothing and some of Cassandra's was found in his abandoned car. Keith's wallet was found in the back seat. See, there's the driver's wallet again. The car's keys were left on the front seat. Eyeglasses and a watch were left on the dashboard. Cassandra's purse was found, but her wallet was missing. It's important to note that the park ranger who discovered the vehicle had removed and went through everything in the car. When he learned it was a potential crime scene, everything was just thrown back in the car with the ranger claiming,
"That's how I found it."
It's been presumed that Keith and Cassandra are dead, although no bodies have ever been found. The crime scene here imitates David and Robin's homicide, in that valuables from the couple were left in the vehicle, as well as shoes and other clothing items. And it's similar to both of the previous double homicides, in that Keith and Cassandra were a young white couple together in a vehicle along the Colonial Parkway, and wallets were left in the car. Just like the wallet was out, ready to show someone their ID. Neither Keith's family nor Cassandra's family believe that the couple drove to Colonial Parkway on their own. Keith's brother insists he wouldn't need to go all the way to Colonial Parkway to make out with a girl. There were plenty of discreet places nearby. Plus, Keith was aware of the Colonial Parkway murders thus far. None of the brothers had any intention of using that area as a makeout spot. But with no bodies, it's impossible to know the manner in which they were murdered. This case was on federal ground and became an FBI case. This brings us to the fourth couple. The fourth couple were 21-year-old Danny Lauer and 18-year-old Anna Marie Phelps. Anna Marie was dating Danny's brother Clint, and on September 5th, 1989, the two were on their way to move Danny in with Anna Marie and Clint. Danny was going to help them pay rent and utilities in their apartment in Virginia Beach. Danny's car wasn't actually found on the Colonial Parkway, but the location it was found was about 30 miles away from it. So law enforcement lumps this case together with the Colonial Parkway murders. Danny's car was found abandoned at a rest stop. I don't know if other countries have these. I assume you do, but it might fall under a different name. Essentially, a rest stop is a big parking lot that's off the highway. It usually has bathrooms, and sometimes there's vending machines for snacks and soft drinks. These rest stops are used a lot by long-haul truckers as a place to park their rig and get some sleep. I have a tiny bladder, so I use them a lot on long road trips. Anyway, the rest stop was off Interstate 64, which about 30 miles down does intersect with the Colonial Parkway. Danny's car was parked really weird. It was on the entrance to the highway ramp, It was half on the shoulder, half on the road, instead of in one of the designated parking spots. The car was also parked on the side of the road, driving away from Virginia Beach instead of towards it where they were headed. There was dirt spackled on the lower half of Danny's car, along with dried long grass. It was as if the car had driven through a rough terrain. Anna Marie carried a roach clip that had blue feathers. This roach clip was attached to the rolled-down driver's side window, almost as if it was a flag trying to call attention to the vehicle. Law enforcement took it as a taunt from the killer. The bodies of Danny and Anna Marie weren't found for another 6 weeks. They were found on October 19, 1989, by a couple of hunters that were on a logging road a couple miles away from the rest stop. The hunters came across the bodies that were covered by a blanket. Actually, the weather had been somewhat warm during this time, so decomposition was accelerated, and Danny and Anna Marie weren't really bodies anymore, but just bones, and they still had their clothes on. Really, no evidence of what killed them was visible. It was speculated that the weapon of choice was a knife, because Anna Marie had a gouge on one of her finger bones, and it was like a defensive wound. The blanket they were covered with was Danny's from his car. Remember, since they were moving Danny, the car was full of his belongings in the back seat and trunk. Danny also had a good amount of money with him in his car. Before he decided to move in with his brother and Anna Marie, he worked several jobs painting houses. He was able to save up between $600 and $800 so he could pay for his share of rent and utilities. But that money was taken. Anna Marie's wallet was also missing. I'm not sure if I personally am inclined to believe this murder is related to the other Colonial Parkway murders. There are similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. The couple was covered with a blanket, which from listening to true crime and watching true crime, victims being covered is often an indication the killer had remorse. Clothing was left on the victims. Money was taken. Those are all differences. The similarities? Okay, they were a young white couple in a car about 30 miles away from the Colonial Parkway, and odd items were left in the car, like the keys. Nobody has ever been arrested for this murder either. This case became one of the Virginia State Police cases. So the FBI is working on the first and third case, and 2 different Virginia State Police offices are working on the other 2 cases. Seems like an awful lot of hands in the pot to me. Circling back to the beginning of our story, I mentioned Julie Williams and her girlfriend Lolly Winans. They were murdered at the end of May 1996 in the Shenandoah National Forest. This is part of the Appalachian Trail. Initially, a man named David Allen Rice was arrested and convicted for the murders of Julie and Lolly. But he was exonerated of the crime when a hair found at the crime scene didn't match his. The hair was indicative of a male DNA, but he wasn't the guy. Many compared this case to that of Cathy Thomas and Becky Dowski, our first couple of the Colonial Parkway Murders victims. Yes, both were lesbian couples. The murders occurred about 3.5 hours in location from each other, which I guess isn't too far. But there's a 10-year time gap between those murders. The method of murder was similar. No sexual assault on either couple, and both murders were pretty grisly, with both sets of women being bound and having their throats slit. I kind of think it's a stretch to say it's the same killer. Just because both couples were lesbians, it's the biggest link in investigators' minds. I mean, we can say the Zodiac killer needs to be examined for the Colonial Parkway murders. What's similar? Both attacked young couples in parked cars. No killer has been caught. Differences: Zodiac was on the West Coast, Colonial Parkway on the East Coast. And in the Colonial case, there's no weirded coded letters sent to law enforcement. Zodiac was late 60s, early 70s. Colonial was mid to late 80s. That one, too, is kind of far-fetched, even though there's similarities. One thing I've seen and heard a lot while researching this case is how rare it is to see couples murdered together. Double homicides. I never really considered that a rarity. I'm sure it's not as common as singular homicides, but rare? From listening to a question-answer style episode, Mind Over Murder, that's Bill Thomas's show, there's a long laundry list of persons of interest in the Colonial Parkway murders, and maybe a handful of credible persons. There has been DNA gathered from all of the crime scenes. Police and FBI are holding it close to their vests, though, which I know can be frustrating for the families who need answers after 35 years of wondering who did this and why to their loved ones. A lot of the forensic evidence was tainted or lost. Do they still have enough evidence to solve the cases? Maybe. It's hard to know since all of the law enforcement involved really aren't saying much. Join me now as we talk to Cathy Thomas's brother, Bill. Hi, Bill. Thank you so much for allowing me to chat with you. I'd like to offer my condolences. I know it's 35 years, but the sadness of losing a loved one remains forever.
Well, thank you, CJ. I'm very excited to be here, and I appreciate your kind thoughts.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about growing up with Cathy and what she was like.
Sure. Well, let's see. The Thomas family, we're an Irish Catholic family from Boston, what used to be called Kennedy Democrats back in the day. My dad was a naval officer, which figures prominently then in Cathy's decision to join the Navy. And my mom was a nurse. So there's 4 kids, very close Irish Catholic family. Cathy's the youngest of 4 kids. My older brother, Richard, myself, Bill, my younger brother, Jack, who's also gay. And our only sister and the youngest is Cathy. And so the 2 older kids are straight and the 2 younger kids are gay. Sometimes I struggle a little bit because obviously we lost Cathy now 34 years ago. And sometimes I'll switch back and forth between the present tense and the past tense. So forgive me. So the 2 older kids are straight and the 2 younger kids are gay. And I remember my sister-in-law, who was married to my older brother, Anne said once at a family dinner, what do you think the chances are that 2 of the 4 kids in the family would be gay? And I remember I said, how the hell would we know? And everybody burst out laughing because it was just part of our lives. You know, both Cathy and Jack had come out to the family. Jack when he was about 18 and a freshman at Yale. And then Cathy after she had graduated from the Naval Academy. So she was a little older, maybe 21 at the time. So once you get to that place where they kind of figured out their own lives, it just was part of our growing up. But back to Cathy as a kid, Cathy was extremely smart, very funny, very warm. She was a great friend and a great sister. She had to kind of stand up for herself because she was the only girl and she was the youngest. And, you know, the family's very Irish. There's lots of teasing. And if anybody thought you were getting a little too big for your britches, there was always somebody there who was going to take you down a peg, including my mom and dad, if necessary. And there was an expectation in the family that you were going to stand up for yourself and know what was going on in the world. You were expected at dinner, if my dad wasn't away with his naval service, but at dinner, you were expected to be able to hold your own conversationally, to have read the Boston Globe and the Lowell Sun, our hometown newspaper that day, and to know what was going on in terms of like current affairs and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, Cathy more than held her own. So she was an amazing person and a real pioneer, but none of that surprised us.
I picture her as really scrappy, definitely able to hold her own with 3 big brothers picking on her probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's probably the best athlete in the house on top of everything else. You know, that was important when we were kids. Now it doesn't seem quite so important, but she was very graceful and athletic and very strong. So yeah, she was an interesting person because she was a little bit shy at first. She had red hair and bright blue eyes and, you know, that peaches and cream complexion. I think people might not notice her right away because she was a little bit quiet at first. But then once you get to know her, you realize, oh my gosh, this woman is like hysterical. And she was very funny and quick to laugh and quick to make a joke and quick to point out life's absurdities. So yeah, she was Scrappy's fair. She could take care of herself. There's no question about it.
You said she came out about when she was 18 or maybe 21?
Yeah, Jack came out at 18. Cathy came out after she had graduated from the Naval Academy must have been about age 21. I remember the weekend she came out.
How did your family react to that?
Well, my mom was very supportive. My dad, he struggled with it a little bit because I think a bit more with Jack a few years before when he had come out. Somehow Dad thought, and you got to picture this. I'm sure this must have happened in other families. My dad somehow thought it reflected poorly on him or his in our upbringing or something like that. I think by the time Cathy came out a few years later, I think they were a little bit more used to the idea. Mm-hmm. Although it's funny, when I think about it, and I know some of these viewpoints are kind of cliched from, growing up in the 60s. Jack coming out wasn't a terrible surprise to us.
Oh.
Back when we were little kids and we moved all over the country because my dad was a naval officer. But I remember Jack got caught kissing someone in a closet at a neighbor's house when we were, very symbolic, when we were playing hide and seek one day. We were probably 8, 9, 10, in that time frame. But he got caught kissing a boy versus kissing a girl. Okay. So when Jack came out to us, those years later, we weren't all that surprised. Whereas with Cathy, it came as more of a surprise. Again, you feel like you know someone, but you don't really understand everything that they're going through in terms of their own life's journey. But it came as a little bit of a surprise, I think, that Cathy was lesbian. And there was a concern in the family about Cathy coming out as lesbian because she was a naval officer. For your younger listeners, they have to understand this is the 1980s. Cathy graduated from the Naval Academy with the class of 1981. It's actually illegal to be gay or lesbian and be in the service. And you could actually be thrown in Fort Leavenworth prison in Kansas, of all places, for being gay or lesbian. Usually what they did was they were trying to, they were driving folks out of the service. Although, again, the idea that there'd be gay men, for example, in the service where they would be surrounded by other men shouldn't have surprised anybody. But there was a real focus on lesbians, we found out, and pushing women out of the service. So some of my family's concern as expressed at that time was because Cathy had attended and graduated from the Naval Academy with the second class of women in it. And now she was serving on board a ship in the United States Navy in a very high profile position. And these Naval Academy grads were a brand new thing back then. And a lot of eyes were on them. And so I think some of the reaction inside the family to Cathy coming out to us was an expression of legitimate concern about what the consequences of being lesbian and an officer in the United States Navy would be in the early 80s.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there was much concern about her being on a ship because there's not too many places you can run when you're out at sea.
Yeah. Well, Cathy was serving aboard a ship called the USS L.Y. Spear, and it was a submarine tender. And submarine tenders don't go out to sea all that much.
Oh, okay.
They are like a floating service station for submarines that pull up alongside. And so a lot of times with the ships like the Spear, they actually were in port and they were home ported in Norfolk, Virginia. So that wasn't as much of a concern. But you did have a concern because Cathy was a young officer. She had 200 people working for her, mostly men. And she was this exotic new breed of young officer who had graduated from the Naval Academy because she was only in the second class to graduate from Annapolis. They weren't out at sea all that much, but she was in a very high visibility location aboard the Spear. And so my parents definitely had some concern about that. Interestingly, as did my older brother Richard, who had also graduated from the Naval Academy. He had gone on to medical school, and he's 6 years older than Cathy is. And Richard expressed a lot of concern that she could be thrown out of the Navy or worse if it was discovered that she was gay.
So you touched briefly upon her being one of the first group of women that was in the Naval Academy. And you also told us a little bit about her experience. I'm wondering if you might be able to build more on how she was treated by fellow Navymen.
Yeah. Well, the problem was mostly the men, unfortunately. It was a real challenge. Now, keep in mind, at this point, my father, Joe Thomas, older brother Richard Thomas, and then our younger sister Cathy are the first ever father, son, daughter graduates of the Naval Academy. So she announced at age 17, I remember, at the dinner table, she announced that the service academies had been opened up to women by the United States Congress in 1976. So the first class to graduate with women was in 1980. This would not just be at Annapolis, but the Air Force Academy, West Point, and so on. I remember my brother Richard, 6 years older, was very concerned that she was in for a very rough ride. He had been through the academy himself. He knew how much hazing there was, how much the upperclassmen at the Naval Academy actually ran the facility with 4,000 midshipmen living in a single dorm, Bancroft Hall, down in Annapolis. And he knew it could be pretty brutal. And then there were a lot of people inside the Navy and at the Naval Academy that were extremely unhappy to have these young women joining the Naval Academy. And so there was a real effort made to completely undermine these women. Now, things are a lot better now. 35 plus years later than they were back then. Gosh, we're coming up on 40 years. But Cathy made it very clear to us that, she was going to get through and she was going to graduate. She made it very clear to us that the Naval Academy was extremely unwelcoming. And they were completely unprepared. And they did nothing, literally nothing, to prepare the women coming in for the onslaught of harassment and, I remember her talking to us about double timing, walking as fast as you can down the hall. And then an upperclassman would call out plebe halt, which they call them plebes. And then, she'd be standing there braced, as straight up and down as she could be. And I remember her telling us stories about guys getting in her face and just screaming at her, like inches away from her face. What are you doing here? We don't want you here. You don't belong at my school. Note the possessive. You don't belong at my school.
My school. Wow.
We don't want you in the Navy. We're going to drive you people out, that kind of thing. And you people. And it was bad. But Cathy just had that inner core, that toughness that we talked about. Now, she was a lovely person and had a sweet side and sentimental side. And she was the one that was always, rooting for the underdog and the abused animals and, you name it. But she had this core too, this steel core, and she was not going to be deterred from succeeding and, graduating from the Naval Academy and becoming a naval officer. That was her goal. So she wasn't going to let these guys that were harassing them. And they did horrible things. They would come in the middle of the night and throw a blanket over them and beat the crap out of them. And I'm not talking about some light hazing here. I'm talking about abuse. And the Naval Academy just completely looked the other way. There was a tremendous amount of harassment. Some of these upperclassmen made it their life's ambition to drive these women out of the Navy. They did not want them. It was not exactly the United States Navy's finest hour.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That's horrible.
Yeah. I remember Cathy telling us that one thing they were forbidden from doing was ever gathering as a group of women to discuss issues. They were actually forbidden from ever gathering as a group to discuss what was going on. And of course, they assigned 2 or 3 women to each of the various companies at the Naval Academy, which were like platoons. And so the only people you had a significant amount of exposure to were the other women in your company. And so what happened is, as their numbers dropped, as women just said, that's it, I'm out of here, they had to keep transferring the remaining women around because they wanted to make certain there were at least, I think 2 was the goal in each of the companies. Now, I want to make it clear, not all of the men were horrible to them. Many of her classmates were very supportive, but upperclassmen were terrible. One of the things I always thought was very striking and disappointing is that each year the graduating class of the Naval Academy chooses a slogan in Latin, which they have engraved on the inside of their ring. And the class of 1979, the last class that did not have women, their motto was all male. Usually it's something uplifting, like Semper Fidelis, or, something about service and about loyalty to country, or, something much more positive. Theirs was all male. That was their mentality. Now, to be fair to them, I do understand that those upperclassmen who effectively ran the Naval Academy had come in under a single-sex arrangement and were graduating under a completely different arrangement where young women had joined their ranks. But they should have also been explicitly told, you will not harass these women, you will not make life difficult for them. And none of that happened. And quite frankly, there were a lot of, older men in the upper reaches of not just the Naval Academy, but the United States Navy that wanted to see these women fail.
They should have been told, suck it up, Buttercup.
Well, that was Cathy's favorite expression, actually.
I think I just channeled her.
Well, I think that's so funny that you just said that. Suck it up, Buttercup was Cathy's favorite expression. And other women would sometimes come to her and, they'd want to talk about what was going on and how difficult things were. And that was the expression she used to use was suck it up, Buttercup. By the way, a lot of these issues that I'm touching on, I'm sure some of your readers are aware of the author Randy Shilts, who passed away from AIDS some years back. He's the guy that wrote And the Band Played On, all about the AIDS crisis.
Okay.
He wrote a second book before he died, tragically, and that book is also very good. It's called Conduct Unbecoming, and it's all about the history of gay and lesbian people in the United States military. And he has an entire chapter devoted to the experience of these young women at the Naval Academy and the amount of harassment that they suffered. Yeah, Conduct Unbecoming. It's quite good.
Okay, I'm going to lead us into the crime of the Colonial Parkway Murders. Do you believe that Cathy and Becky were murdered because of their sexual orientation? And if you do, why?
I definitely do believe that my sister Cathy and her second girlfriend, Rebecca Dowski, who was a senior at William and Mary, I do believe that their murder ties in directly to Cathy's naval service. Cathy graduated from the Naval Academy in 1981, and she served aboard the L.Y. Spear, as we talked about, for 3 years. During that time, I understand that what was then called the NIS, the Naval Investigative Service, now referred to as the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS. So I may use those terms NIS and NCIS interchangeably. They were doing what they called one of their periodic purges of lesbians. For some reason, in this kind of very hate-filled time frame of the 1980s, in Norfolk, Virginia, the largest port for the United States Navy on the East Coast, the NCIS was very focused on driving women out of the service. So they're responsible for the Navy and the Marine Corps. And they were much less focused, and I can't explain why, they were focused on lesbians and not gay men, interestingly. So they were doing all of these interrogations, which is going back to like the McCarthy era, where they would be dragged in and accused of being a lesbian and interrogated and intimidated. And they were trying to trip women up and kick them out of the service. And as part of one of those periodic purges, a young woman was brought before the NIS, NCIS, and interrogated. During that multiple-hour interrogation, she coughed up that she had seen an officer. This young woman was an enlisted person. She'd seen an officer in a very well-known lesbian bar in Norfolk called the Hershey Bar, Hershey. Hee. It's a legendary lesbian bar. It's been in Norfolk for over, I think it's close to 40 years. It just closed fairly recently. And I had a chance to go there and meet with Annette Stone, who was the longtime owner, who's an absolutely wonderful woman. So this young enlisted woman, under pressure from NIS interrogators, coughed up that she had seen my sister, Cathy, in this lesbian bar. And that started a 6-month, 9-agent investigation into my sister's sexuality. And I asked people, why would they devote so much time to Cathy Thomas? And the answer is, I think it's 4 parts. She was a woman. She was a lesbian. She was an officer. Keep in mind, that's real important in a military structure. And wait for it, she was a Naval Academy grad at a time when graduates of the United States Naval Academy who happened to be women were extremely rare. And remember, there are all these higher ups inside the Navy that want to see these women fail. So I now believe that this 1984 inquiry into Cathy's sexuality was directly connected to her murder. So Cathy was investigated, and she was able to avoid being kicked out of the Navy, but she was very concerned about what a close call that she'd had. The skipper of the ship, the L.Y. Spear, shut down the investigation, and she was able to continue her naval career, but she began to realize that the Navy was going to do everything it could to get rid of these women. And you really couldn't be lesbian and be in the Navy. It just was completely incompatible at that point. So she was very sad about this, but she made a decision that she wasn't going to be able to have the kind of career that my father or my older brother Richard had in the Navy. You know, my dad was a naval officer and stayed in for 20 years. My older brother Richard went to med school. He actually stayed in the Navy for over 30 years. Cathy wanted that kind of long career. She was very interested in service. She was extremely patriotic. She really wanted to excel and be a successful naval officer. She was one of the first women in the history of the United States Navy to become what they call a surface warfare officer. That is someone who was qualified to run a Navy ship from the bridge. Again, these opportunities hadn't been there before, but she was determined, to make her mark. She made the sad decision to leave the Navy. And if you attend the academy, you go to Annapolis for 4 years and graduate, and then you owe the Navy 5 years. So she made a decision very quietly. She didn't confer with my family. She made the decision that she was going to get to 5 years and leave the Navy with some reluctance, I'm sure, but she felt like she was no longer welcome in the Navy. Now, she ended up dying about 4 months or so after she left the Navy. And I'm now convinced that there is a direct relationship between Cathy's naval service, her decision to get out of the Navy, and her murder that following fall. And so it's like 120 days or so from the time she left the Navy till the time she was murdered.
So I know you've been advocating for justice for Cathy and Becky and for all of the other victims for years.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you believe that the same killer is responsible for any of the other duos that were murdered.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second so your listeners will understand. There's a lot of information available on the so-called Colonial Parkway Murders online, and we've just had a television series come out called The Lover's Lane Murders, which is all about the murders. So with the Colonial Parkway Murders, let's just go over the basics. Colonial Parkway Murders run from 1986 to 1989. And so what happens is you have the murder of 4 young couples, approximately one couple a year for 4 years in a row. And it starts with a lesbian couple, Cathy and Becky, and then 3 straight couples follow, approximately one couple a year under very similar circumstances. And there have been a lot of theories about, well, these 4 double homicides must be related because, they happen in and around the Norfolk area, closer to Williamsburg, Virginia, which is not far away, in the so-called peninsula or tidewater area of Virginia, very pretty area. But the thinking is that, well, there's no way that 4 double homicides of 4 young couples, 1 lesbian and 3 straight, are not related. But yet, the more I learn about the Colonial Parkway murders, the less convinced I am that they are related. First of all, there's nothing in the forensics in the Colonial Parkway murders that links the 4 double homicides. So scientifically, and, for folks that follow, true crime, that sort of thing, that DNA and other evidence will often link cases. And that has not happened here. There are some basic circumstantial similarities with young couples, cars, isolated rural locations. They're all in, if you use the center point of the so-called Colonial Parkway, which is a very pretty national park where Cathy and Becky were found and another couple went missing. If you use that as a center point, you can go out about 30 miles in either direction, and that's where the other murders take place. So they're roughly together in the same place. And more similarities, the couples are parked. It appears they may have been approached by an authority figure, could be law enforcement or a deputy sheriff or someone like that. I'm going to generalize here, but overall, there's limited sign of struggles, a significant amount of struggle in Cathy and Becky's case, but in the other cases, limited sign of struggle, one possible robbery, but in several other examples, wallets and purses are out and even open, almost as if someone had been approached by a law enforcement figure. Now, keep in mind, this could be a cop or it could be an imposter. And at night, and some of these locations are extremely dark. And if you picture yourself sitting there listening to music and maybe being romantic with your partner, you're not really paying attention to your surroundings. And if someone rolled up on you and, let's say, had the brights on or maybe had lights, flashing type lights up on the dashboard, you might think they were legitimately law enforcement. We don't know. But the couples end up being killed in or near their cars, and then they're left there. In one example, Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, another couple that were apparently killed on the Colonial Parkway, they completely disappeared. This is over 30 years ago now, have never been found. Keith's car, his Toyota Celica, is found at Half Moon Pull-Off along this very pretty Colonial Parkway, about a mile and a half from where Cathy's 1980 Honda Civic had been found a year and a half prior. So it's very hard not to think, well, a couple disappears over here, lesbian couple is killed over there. Is there a connection? Right. But the more I learn about the cases, and I've met with a lot of experts, and we just did this television show, as I mentioned, we're still not seeing any links, scientific links, forensic links between the crime scenes. So the direct answer to your question is I'm less and less convinced that all of the Colonial Parkway murders are necessarily related.
Okay. So do you think we're not seeing links because the FBI and the 2 Virginia police departments or the state, what are they, state troopers? But there's 2 different offices that have a case each. Do you think it's because they're not sharing with each other?
Well, the information sharing now in 2021 is much better than it was back in the late 1980s when these crimes took place. Back in the late 1980s, there was a lack of coordination between these various agencies. And one of the things that makes solving America's, get ready for this number, 250,000 cold case homicides. There are 250,000 unsolved cold case murders in the United States. One of the things that makes it so complicated is that we have such a Byzantine setup of law enforcement agencies. Here's another number for you. There are 17,000 different law enforcement agencies in the United States, and they don't coordinate very well. They're better now than they were back then. But back then, and this is a pre-internet environment, your younger listeners are going to be like, there was life before the internet? But yes, there really was life before the World Wide Web. But the agencies did not coordinate well and did not share information. There was a lot of turf wars, if you will, competition, and people thought very locally. And so even in the beginning of the Colonial Parkway murders, there wasn't much thinking that after Cathy and Becky were killed, that a second couple, Robin Edwards and David Knobling, were killed about almost exactly a year later, about 30 miles away at a place called the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge. And as far as we can tell, it didn't even occur to anybody in law enforcement that there might be a relationship between the second case of a couple being killed on a lover's lane to back to Cathy and Becky being found in my sister's car a year prior. It's not till
the second one being David and Robin.
Correct. And then it's not till we get to the third case, which is Keith and Cassandra Haley, a young couple out on a first date. They disappeared after heading home from a college party at Christopher Newport University, which is Newport News, Virginia. They were heading home and apparently were intercepted. They are the couple that disappeared and were never found again. And then Keith's car is found at this bluff overlooking the York River, quite close to where Cathy and Becky's car had been found a year and a half prior. By that point now we're back inside the national park, the Colonial Parkway, and the FBI is the responsible agent. If you're murdered inside a national park, the FBI is the lead agency from the get-go. Only at that point, now we're 2.5 years into a 4-year cycle, do they realize we may have a problem. And then another year plus goes by, and then a fourth couple goes missing along Interstate 64. They were driving down to Virginia Beach. And it's funny, we say couple, but they're not really a couple. This is a young woman, Anna Maria Phelps, and her boyfriend's brother. They're basically traveling companions. They go missing along Interstate 64. They're driving from a rural area called Amelia County, Virginia, where they're from, heading to Virginia Beach. And they go missing along the interstate. And then Daniel Lauer, the driver, his old Chevy Nova is found on the opposite side of Interstate 64 that is headed in the wrong direction, back towards Amelia County instead of towards Virginia Beach, which is eastbound, which is their destination. And they go missing and their bodies are not found for about 6 weeks. And eventually they're found by hunters lying side by side in the woods. And the bodies were so badly decomposed, they had a very difficult time figuring out how they died. They actually believe they may have been stabbed based on nick marks on the bones. I believe it's of Anna Maria. The Smithsonian Institution was actually brought in because the bodies were in such an advanced state of decomposition. They think that the nick marks on her hand bones were from a defensive wound that she might have been putting up to prevent someone from attacking her further. So we have these various scenarios, and I have used the word couples, but the truth is, when you recap, the only serious couple actually is the lesbian couple, Cathy and Becky. They've been a serious couple for about 6 months. We were very excited to be meeting Becky that Thanksgiving, and unfortunately they died on or about October 9th, 1986. So we never had a chance to meet Becky, which is, very much to my family's regret. We were very excited about meeting her at Thanksgiving. But then the other couples, the second couple, Robin and David, had just met that day. So they're not really a couple. They may have been engaged in sexual activity. That's a possibility. They're not a serious couple. The third couple, that's Keith and Sandy, the ones that went missing along the York River, they're on a first date. And then the fourth couple aren't a couple either. They're, as we talked about, traveling companions.
Right.
Anna and Daniel are driving together to meet up with Daniel's older brother, Clint. So it's funny, we say couples, and then the television shows even called the Lover's Lane murders. They are found in places that are known as Lover's Lanes, but not necessarily all of them are involved in, romance or fooling around or lovemaking or what have you.
Yeah, but Lover's Lane sounds better than Liker's Lane.
or traveling companion lane.
There you go. Just met her today, Lane.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Bill, I think you'd be a great diplomat because you have a lot of tact. I don't, so I'm just going to say it.
No, go right ahead.
A lot of law enforcement screw-ups in this case. Things that should have happened but didn't. Things that should not have happened but did, including agencies keeping information from each other like we kind of discussed.
Right.
but also there was evidence that was destroyed or given back to the family. And I'm speaking of the vehicles.
Yeah. Oh, it's terrible. The way crime scenes are handled now in 2021 is very different from the way they were handled back in 1986 to 1989. But even by the standards of the late 1980s, the crime scenes are atrociously handled. The vehicles in 3 of the 4 examples, the only vehicle that's not returned to the families is Cathy's white 1980 Honda, because it was so blood-soaked inside that they wouldn't have given us the car back. In the other examples, the cars are actually returned to the families, in some cases immediately. So they're completely compromised in terms of evidence testing. It's unbelievable how sloppy some of the work done was. In the Keith Call and Cassandra Haley example, it appears that National Park Service rangers who patrolled the 23-mile-long ribbon of land that is the Colonial Parkway, when they found Keith's Toyota Celica on this bluff overlooking the river, for reasons no one's ever explained, they actually took the couple's clothing out of the car and took it away to the ranger station. Only later, when they found out, oh, this couple may be missing, this could be a crime scene, the rangers headed back to the Toyota and folded up the clothes and put them in the back seat. And it goes on from there. We found out a few years ago that 8 years after Cathy and Becky were murdered, there was a bureaucratic foul up, and my sister Cathy and her girlfriend Becky's rape kits were accidentally sent to another law enforcement agency, York County Sheriff's Department, who were investigating another homicide. There was a phone call, and apparently they discussed the fact that the Thomas Dowski rape kits had gotten mixed in. And I don't mean, evidence mix, but the little box that it came in, they were in with some evidence in another case. And so it was clearly a problem. And this is one evidence property clerk talking to another evidence property clerk. And so there was a back and forth, as I understand it, in terms of whose mistake was it, and was the FBI going to send somebody over to York County to pick up the rape kits, or was York County going to send somebody over to the FBI office in Newport News to get the rape kits? And so there's this back and forth. And then finally, they sort of lock into their positions. And you could see this happening. They end up, each side is refusing to come over and get or drop off the rape kits. So what do? They sit there, and then eventually the FBI faxes, this is pre-internet now, faxes over a letter ordering York County to destroy the rape kits as a medical waste. So they burned the rape kits. Now, to be clear, as far as we know, Cathy and Becky were not sexually assaulted. The rape kits had been tested within the limits of the capability back in 1986. But as the Commonwealth of Virginia chief medical examiner said to me, Mr. Thomas, you never throw away evidence in an unsolved murder case. I mean, it's insane, the stuff that they've done. All of this, by the way, culminates in 2009. A story broke on television news in that area. A reporter named Mike Mather from WTKR, which is the CBS affiliate, he broke a story that the FBI had lost control of 78 highly graphic crime scene photos from all 4 of the double homicides. And these started out life as color and black and white photographs that would have been taken by official FBI and Virginia State Police photographers. And also contained in this slideshow were, maps and things like that would explain the case to someone that was trying to understand it. Even, when we talk about the case, CJ, it's kind of complicated. So this would have been helpful to law enforcement personnel who were trying to understand this unsolved case that had been going on for so long. But apparently what happened was the slides were ultimately transferred into a PowerPoint presentation. So they had started out life in a Kodak carousel slideshow, but eventually were transferred to an electronic format. A local retired deputy sheriff was approached, a guy named Fred Atwell, was approached by a company now defunct called the Mid-Atlantic Training Academy. And Atwell was asked if he wanted to come in and speak about the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders to this training academy where they trained security guards and private investigators. And Atwell, who worked for the Virginia Sheriff's Office, said, well, I was around back then, but I didn't work the case, so I'm not an expert. And his buddy, who had invited him to come in and speak to the students, had said, well, we have the crime scene photos from that case. Now, Atwell claims, and you got to take this with a huge grain of salt because Atwell was nothing if not out for himself. Atwell claims he was outraged by this leak of the crime scene photos by the FBI. And he claims that he went back to the FBI and the Virginia State Police and told them, your crime scene photos are out in the public. They're at this training academy. And he also claims, and I believe him actually, that the FBI and the Virginia State Police did not follow up on this. So eventually, Atwell went to the media with the story. And so there ended up being 2 stories in the media about how the FBI had lost control of these crime scene photos, which did happen. So the story was very embarrassing to the FBI, but it's yet another example of how this case has not been treated with the appropriate amount of respect and dedication of resources. And this leak of the crime scene photos is actually what led me to get more directly involved in my sister and Rebecca Dowski's unsolved murder. So there is some upside from the family's perspective, which is that this is 12 years ago now. I got much more involved in the Colonial Parkway murders after discovering, I was living in California at the time, discovering a few weeks after this story broke that there had been this leak of these crime scene photos, which of course the FBI had not told us about, and they had not followed up appropriately. And I was pretty outraged, and I began asking questions and digging into the Colonial Parkway murders. And that's led to an intensive campaign on my part and on the part of the other 8 families to push the FBI and the Virginia State Police to put resources back into the Colonial Parkway murders, because a lot of experts tell me this is a solvable case.
I realized that the crime started just as DNA evidence was actually becoming a thing. And you said on your podcast, and I thought it was super interesting, that every time DNA is tested, it uses up a portion of DNA, and that makes sense. So do you think with all the other bumblings that the authorities might not have enough of certain DNA from the crimes anymore? Like, I would imagine if Cathy and Becky put up a fight, there would be some kind of skin or some kind of DNA under their fingernails of the killer.
Well, it's definitely a possibility. We've been covering the Colonial Parkway murders pretty intensively on our podcast, and thank you for mentioning it. It's called Mind Over Murder, and it's hosted by Kristen Dilley, who's a wonderful teacher from Williamsburg, and myself. We've been doing our podcast for over a year now, and we've now shifted our attention to the Colonial Parkway murders after covering a number of other cases. DNA testing was not a thing really in 1986. It wasn't really used until the early 90s in any kind of consistent way in law enforcement applications. I mean, obviously DNA existed, but DNA testing didn't exist. And it is true that a number of DNA tests that have been run over the last 30 years have consumed some DNA. The good news is that the new tests that are online now use little or no DNA, so they don't consume it,
right, as fast.
In the way that it was done in the past, and they're much more precise than they ever have been before. But our challenge in the Colonial Parkway murders is we believe we have potential perpetrator DNA in 3 of the 4 crime scenes. The challenge is that our DNA is now 30 to 35 years old, and time is not kind to forensic evidence like that because it does deteriorate over time. And so that's a challenge. And then in some examples, like in the Edwards Knobling example, there is a very small amount of badly degraded DNA left. Robin and David's bodies were dumped into the James River there, and they believe were probably in the water for 3 days. So the DNA available is not in great condition to start with. And plus it's 30 years old. Plus it's been diminished in terms of the amount remaining because of past DNA testing. But I think from talking to, for instance, the Edwards and Knobling families, our attitude is we've been waiting for over 30 years for answers. even if this next round of testing uses the last bit or some of the last bit of remaining DNA, first of all, it'll use less than was ever required before. And the second thing is we've been waiting for answers in the Colonial Parkway murders for over 30 years. What are we waiting for?
Right.
So
absolutely.
I won't claim to speak for the families in this example, but I have talked to them about it. And I think that the Edwards and Knopling families would be fine with moving forward because we're looking for answers here. And, what happens with the endless delays and lack of resolution of these 16 parents of the 8 victims, we've got 8 victims, we've got 16 moms and dads. 8 of them are already gone now. They've passed away waiting for answers in their loved ones' unsolved murders and disappearances. So I think our attitude in general is, what are we waiting for? Let's just keep testing the evidence and trying to move this case forward. Enough with the, this case might go to trial someday and that sort of thing. It's like, you haven't even ever arrested anyone in this case. We've had 150 persons of interest in this case over the years, but they haven't ever even arrested a single person. And these are 8 young people, 4 young couples, and we still don't have any answers.
Can you tell my listeners about your upcoming projects? We already kind of touched upon Mind Over Murder, your podcast. I also told my listeners about Oxygen's Lovers Lane Murders, but you have a book coming out as well.
Well, it'll come out at some point, CJ. I've been working on a book on the Colonial Parkway Murders, but we don't have any plans yet for publishing it. It's sort of a labor of love. I've been so busy with our podcast, Mind Over Murder, and then working on the television series that I haven't had much chance to work on the book, but I promise I'll get back to it. Something that's happened in the last several years is that we've been approached by a number of other families who recognize that we've made some significant strides in the Colonial Parkway murders. We've gotten the attention of the media and write-ups in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and lots of interest from Virginia newspapers and radio and television stations. And now we have the new television series, The Lovers Lane Murders. So people have approached us about us helping them with their unsolved cases. So we try as much as we can to provide advice and support to other families who are going through, the kind of same thing that we have gone through. And as I mentioned, you got 250,000 cold case homicides across the United States, plus hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits sitting on law enforcement shelves across the country. So we have a lot of work to do. And one of the things I'm starting to try to do is pivot to this larger issue of how do we move forward this crisis. I think this should be a national scandal that there are that many unsolved homicides and that many unsolved rapes and sexual assaults across the country. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of families waiting for answers in what happened to their loved ones, whether they survived a rape or sexual assault or whether they are missing or murdered. I mean, I think this is a national embarrassment. And when we solve the Colonial Parkway murders, note the optimism, my intention is to pivot to this larger issue. And Kristen Dilley, my podcast partner, she calls me her partner in crime. Our intention is to pivot to those larger issues about America's unsolved murders and what a national scandal that should be.
Is there anything my listeners might be able to do to put some pressure on the FBI?
Well, I appreciate the thought. I'll have to give that some thought. Who knows? Maybe.
Okay. You'll get back to me on it then, I guess.
They don't react real well to public pressure, interestingly. Although I'm being more outspoken, as we've talked about here on your podcast, I think Cathy and Becky's murder is quite likely a hate crime and deserves to be looked at from that perspective. We join a long list of hate crimes against LGBTQ people, and it's 30 plus years ago they didn't even talk about the fact that Cathy and Becky were gay. The newspaper coverage and the radio and television coverage, there were a lot of euphemisms used back then.
Right.
But when I got more heavily involved in the case 12 years ago, I had said from the beginning that I think that Cathy and Becky's sexuality is actually very important to understanding their part in this case. And I think that we shouldn't be papering over the fact that this was a gay couple, that these were two lesbian women. We should be talking about that because I think that will lead us to the answers we're seeking.
I was just thinking of our conversation earlier about Cathy Thomas and her friend, Becky Dowski.
Right. Well, and at the same time that we have to think about that was the time, as you remember, and that was how
It was
things.
the 80s. Everything was possible in the 80s. It should have been anyway.
It should have been. But remember, this is also Virginia. It's a very conservative area. It's a very strongly military area, which is what brought Cathy there. Now, Becky was there to attend William and Mary, where she was a senior, but it was a very different time and a very different place, and people were not out,
Right, and I guess 80s California very different from 80s Virginia.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And having lived in both on the East Coast and the West Coast, and just left West Hollywood 2 years ago, obviously you can live your life in a much more open way in California in 2021 than you could in pretty conservative, perhaps homophobic, is not too far from the truth, Virginia in 1986. One Virginia case we haven't mentioned, which could be linked to Cathy and Becky's murder, of course, is the murder of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans in 1996.
Did I skip over that question?
You
That
did?
is one of my questions. My question is, what is your opinion when people say that the same killer of Cathy and Becky might be the one who took the lives of the Appalachian trail campers, Julie Williams and Lolly Winans?
Well, the FBI did say in 1996, at the time of the Williams Winans murder, they did say that the two crimes, that is Cathy and Becky's murder and Julie and Lolly's murder 10 years later, were, quote, substantially similar, unquote. They're both athletic women, lesbian couples, outdoorsy types killed in a national park on a 3-day holiday weekend. And without getting too graphic in terms of them being bound and their throats being slashed and so on, they're very similar. Now, I can't say for sure that they are necessarily related, but they are remarkably similar. They are 10 years apart and about 180 miles apart, one part of Virginia to the other. One curious detail is that there are 4 National Park Service rangers who were working in the Colonial National Park in 1986, that were working in the Shenandoah National Park in 1996 in time for the murder of Julie and Lolly. And one of them was a person of interest in Cathy and Becky's murder. And yet somehow this guy who had been a person of interest, who was a National Park Service ranger, now retired, was permitted to be one of the lead investigators in the Williams Winans murder, even though the FBI said the two murders were substantially similar. And no one's ever been able to give me a good answer as to why you would let a guy who was a suspect in Cathy and Becky's murder investigate a substantially similar murder of another lesbian couple 10 years later. That does not sit well with me at all.
Was he a Navy man?
No, he was not. He was a career National Park Service ranger, as was his wife.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with my listeners?
No, just how much we appreciate the support, and I hope people will take an interest in Cathy and Becky's murders and the murders of all of the young people in the Colonial Parkway murders. And I really appreciate your interest. You and I have actually been social media friends for several years.
Yeah, until I just put the two together that you're Cathy Thomas's brother.
Well, I'm very proud to be Cathy Thomas's brother and identified as such. So it's great to make the connection, and I appreciate your taking the time.
Well, Bill, Cathy sounded like an incredible young woman who still had so many amazing things she was going to do in this world. I hope, I pray that someday soon that justice is going to be found for all of them.
Well, me too, and I appreciate the thought.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
I would love to hear from you, Rainbow Warriors. What are your opinions of the Colonial Parkway murders? Do you think it's a serial killer? Do you think these were all separate events? Do you think any of the double homicides are related? Let's start a thread on the Beyond the Rainbow Facebook group to get your opinions. And as always, thanks for listening. Love you guys. And remember, it's not a crime to be gay. Unless you're a murderer.